Welcome to the first module for URP 4430, Planning for Hazards and Disasters. The three course level objectives for this course is to number one, identify the hazards that communities face with regards to natural and human-caused disasters. Number two, prepare communities for all hazards disaster planning. And number three, compare and explain tools for community resilience. What you should have completed by now in order not to get behind in this course is you should have logged into Canvas and completed the syllabus quiz. And you should have introduced yourself on the discussion forum to the entire course. The unit objectives for this unit, which is the vision of a resilient community and anticipating disruption, is to number one, explain the processes for planners to engage with communities in disaster planning and to identify the mechanisms in local government that can be used to advance recovery planning. This week, the readings are chapters 1 and 2 in the Schwab book. For your assignment, please find a recent article that discusses a disaster. Summarize the article and provide a link to that article, and relate the information to the course readings for the week. In order to earn full credit, you must post your discussion by the due date, and then you have a week then to reply to at least 3 of your classmates' posts. Let's review some of the readings. Chapter 1, the vision of a resilient community. What is a resilient community? The National Academy of Sciences define resilience as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. Major hurricanes have changed disaster policy, as we'll see with Hurricane Andrew. Gottschalk defines a resilient community as the goal is to assist communities in withstanding an extreme event without suffering devastating losses and without requiring a great deal of outside assistance. The impacted communities survive and continue to function. They might bend from disaster stresses, but they do not break. Instead of repeated damage and continued demands for federal disaster assistance, resilient communities proactively protect themselves against hazards, build self-sufficiency, and become more sustainable. Resilience is the capacity to absorb severe shock and return to a desired state following a disaster. It involves technical, organizational, social, and economic dimensions. It is fostered not only by government, but also by individual, organization, and business actions. So, Hurricane Andrew made landfall in Homestead August 24th, 1992. Some of the key major changes that we see are in the building codes and in the funding mechanisms that occur in Florida to prepare for disasters, including evacuation planning and sheltering. But building codes is fundamentally seen as one of the largest impacts. Before Hurricane Andrew, we had much weaker building codes. After Hurricane Andrew's aftermath, legislators were motivated to create much stronger and stricter building codes to make buildings withstand more severe and strong winds. I want to talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina, which is my story. As I noted, you're going to read and find information from the local news sources about Hurricane Andrew. I went through Hurricane Katrina. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. I had just moved to New Orleans a couple of weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit. And right immediately afterwards, on September 6, 2005, I wrote an article called Carlos in the Eye of Katrina and talked about how New Orleans, despite the fact that everyone knew the major hurricane would hit New Orleans, they hadn't adequately put together good evacuation plans to evacuate the Carlos folks in New Orleans. This was what the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina looked like. These were photos that I took upon returning to New Orleans, believe it or not in August or September, but in November. This was 2 months. After 2 months after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, I returned to New Orleans and took these photos here. This is after the floodwaters had been drained. This is an old grocery store with all the debris racked up. Right here you could see, oh my slides are moving by themselves. This right here shows September 12th, this house was checked. And the numbers on the bottom and the left represent how many bodies and pets were found in each of these buildings. You could see the flood lines on these houses right here. You could see the debris, the homes right here, all of the signs for the disaster cleanup, some images from folks. This is a roof where somebody used an axe to get out. You can see major trees being knocked out, infrastructure damaged, cars flipped over, boats on people's front lawns. This is in a gas station where the top came down. This is an old store. Another boat here. This is the Katrina dump site where they put all the debris. You can see the massive amounts of debris, which is taller than the telephone poles here. So after Hurricane Katrina, another major hurricane hit the United States, which also had some major impacts on our national policy. And this was Hurricane Sandy, or known as Superstorm Sandy. Superstorm Sandy hit October 22nd, 2012, and it taught our nation a key lesson. No one is immune from disasters and climate change, despite impacts from all areas. Challenges to the National Disaster Policy Framework resulted. Sorry, the slide's getting cut off. Apologize for that. The American Planning Association's hazard mitigation integrating best practice into planning identified the ways in which integrated natural hazards mitigation into land use planning can help a community become more resilient. So it looks at intelligence about long-term threats posed by natural hazards to the safety and viability of human development and environmental resources. Problem-solving needs to cope with imminent threats prior to, during, and after a disaster. We need advanced planning to avoid or to mitigate harm from future disaster to recover afterwards. And we need management strategies to implement plans through policies, regulations, capital improvements, acquisition, and taxation. The American Planning Association has this online resource, and you could go there, which is www.planning.org/research/post-disaster. It's supposed to be, I believe, disaster. I pulled it up here. So you could see here, when you go to that website, spell out all the post-disaster, planning for post-disaster recovery, next generation. And you could look, this right here is the book that, the report that has a lot of information that we're using, disaster recovery programs, model ordinances, case studies, symposium from 2011. So you can also go over here to this applied research, and there's information on all sorts of stuff beyond just hazard planning as well. But this is really good, useful information. So Chapter 2, Anticipating Disruption, looks at states' roles in recovery planning. Every state has different policies and systems, but general functions include inventories of critical facilities, states looking at preparedness programs, grants administration for Federal Emergency Management Agency, hazard mitigation funds, and grants administration for FEMA post-disaster recovery funds. Resilience through systems looks at these key terms: diversity, redundancy, decentralization, transparency, collaboration, failing gracefully, flexibility, and foresight. And this right here defines each of those systems, so each of the terms. So you can pause this and look at this in more detail if you like. Resilience management through cross-benefit analysis looks at the Government Finance Officers Association framework of risk assessment. This looks at identifying risks, assessing risks, identifying risk mitigation approaches, assess expected risk reduction, and select and implement the mitigation method. Building resilience capacity looks at this timeline. So you have a disaster event, you have a response phase, and then the response moves into a phase of the recovery, which includes creating the organizing for recovery planning and a recovery plan, recovery management, and then there are subsequent recovery phases after the first recovery phase. The context for recovery planning, mitigation recovery planning, include planning processes within federal, state influences, different federal agencies like HUD, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, USDOT, which is U.S. Department of Transportation, state departments of transportation. There's comprehensive planning, including resiliency goals and hazard mitigation. There's community conditions such as patterns of blight, neighborhood instability, and commercial decline. Again, these are all contexts for the recovery planning process. Community intervention programs such as land assembly, redevelopment, and business subsidies. Locals are responsible for recovery planning, not federal or state government. That's important to remember. The types of recovery plans include two types: those that are prepared before a disaster and those that are prepared after a disaster. Not every community has a recovery plan, but a lot do. So, if you think, does my community have a recovery plan? If a major hurricane hit my community, does it have a recovery plan in place? And if not, then a recovery plan would need to be created after the disaster, which can take a lot of time and slow the disaster recovery down significantly. There's also operational plans. The Florida planning legislation has made post-disaster redevelopment plan an official designation within the state for an element of comprehensive plans that is intended to establish policies for governing recovery functions after disasters. Again, Florida is ahead of the curve on this. Not all states require that, but it's important. And not all communities in Florida are as well prepared as others, even though the state does encourage the creation of a post-disaster redevelopment plan within the municipal comprehensive plan. Policy plans include pre-disaster plans prescribing policies for managing post-disaster recovery. They have a relatively short history. Most date no earlier than the 1990s, and even then they were quite rare. Recovery plan, the term refers to those developed specifically after a disaster has occurred to deal directly with the known consequences of the disaster. The distinguishing feature of such plans is not only the timing of their preparation, but their orientation towards physical planning and urban design. So some of the key lessons for recovery planning is the use of damage assessments. This is where community officials go around the community and they take detailed assessments of the damage that occurred from the disaster. Knowing that damage sometimes can vastly exceed forecasts. So sometimes you may forecast what the damage is, but the actual damage could cost a lot more. So it's important to have these damage assessments in place because it's the basis of what the federal government can reimburse local governments for through a number of grant programs and insurance programs. Also, a key lesson for recovery planning is to harness the chance to change development patterns and to open new forms of economic development potential. So sometimes in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, it gives the community a good opportunity to rethink how they're doing things. And, if a community, for example, is very car dependent, the community may say, well, let's rechange our development patterns to create more opportunities for walkable communities or public transportation, or new economic development opportunities for redeveloping certain parts of the town that might be blighted. Geographic information systems is used in hazards. Here's an example from a web application developed by Dr. Diana Mitsova, who's a professor in our School of Urban Regional Planning. She, along with 4 grad students, put together coastal studies across southern Florida that have been used to help try to understand environmental areas, and the research was, in this case, was sponsored by the Nature Conservancy and incorporated into the organization's website, focused on coastal erosion. So you can, look at examples that we've done right here in at FAU that applies to the Southeast region. So that is the end of the Unit 1 lecture. Please go to the website. Make sure you do your readings and make sure you follow the instructions for the discussion forum for the Unit 1 module. Thank you very much.